And next up, let's bring our fashionably late Mr. Haas Infrared. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. So, yeah, introduce yourself, tell people where you lie on the political spectrum, and where people can find you.
Um, Sorry, one moment. I'm just dealing with some stream stuff. Uh, okay, we're good. So I'm Haas from the Infrared Collective. I'm a I would consider myself an orthodox Marxist-Leninist. In the international sense of the word, like as far as the reigning communist parties are concerned. But in the Western sense of the word, we would be considered quite unorthodox, right, as Marxist Leninists. So my view is that basically on this question is that I'm completely opposed to the way in which the Western left has interpreted and translated the experience of 20th century communism into Western countries, and I seek to challenge and reevaluate that.
Alrighty. So, yeah, here's what we'll do. Each person can give, I'm hearing myself echo a bit. Okay, maybe not. Yeah, so each person can give an opening statement, can be as little as 1 minute, no longer than 5, about the topic and your stance. After that, we'll open up the floor for those watching. If you have questions, tag politically provoked so we know you're talking to us and not the chat. We will get to the Q&A at the end, and we'll do closing statements and final thoughts after the Q&A. So why don't we get started with opening statements? Matthew, when you get us going.
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be here. And, for me, one of the most important things I think is to define terms so we're not talking past each other accidentally. National Bolshevism has been used by a variety of people in numerous countries to describe socialism, Bolshevism that's neither liberal nor cosmopolitan. In a lot of ways, my political and social philosophy is in line with Ho Chi Minh, for instance, who he defined the idea of patriotism and nationalism as not the bourgeois definition of a selfish nationalism, a chauvinism, but one that respected the rights and interests of not only his own national community, but all other nations, while not harming common interests and having an international sense of solidarity. This internationalism should be based on independence, self-reliance, and self-determination, which is what I'm advocating for my people. Here in the United States, I think one of the biggest problems is often people look to historical movements and they try and shoehorn that essentially into an American context. And, as Kim Il-sung said, that, the revolution cannot be imported. It's got to be naturally developed among the people. And going back to the Palmer raids, going back to the first and second Red Scare, going to COINTELPRO, and all the attacks that have been levied against working class movements in this country, up to and including assassinations of guys like Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party, the real left in the United States hasn't existed for a very long time. And what does exist is the sort of settlers variety that, they claim that anyone that cares about class is a quote unquote class reductionist. And anyone that has an affirmative ethnic identity is somehow not able to be a socialist. I think that you can be a socialist and have an affirmative tie to who you are, to your people, to your community, while still having that spirit of internationalism and solidarity. So I support self-determination, and I believe that we really have the ability to not get stuck diving into abstractions, but instead finding out what the real struggles are of working people. I mean, for myself, I've spent over a decade in various forms of activism, a lot of it based on community organizing and charity events, of working with real working people. And a lot of the modern left, not saying y'all, but a lot of the modern left doesn't really know what a real working class person is, or it seems like they have a sense of classism that hates and rejects them. So I think we're in a place here in 2021 where a real socialism can be developed and we can be able to make real material gains for the working class and give them a voice, and identity, which is part of the human experience, can be an important part of that.
All right, so you can just jump right in then.
All right. So just beginning based on what you said, especially initially, I don't really think I have any contention with that. I also don't think that there's anything incompatible between socialism or communism with the specific civilizational and national realities of various different peoples. I guess just based on face value, based on what you already said, I guess what I would be interested in knowing is what specifically separates your view of, I think you call it National Bolshevism from Orthodox Marxism-Leninism, because there's National Bolshevism is kind of a very ambiguous term when I hear it, right? Because on the one hand, it can refer to the phenomena from the 1990s in Russia with Limanov and those kind of people, which I identify as it was a kind of provocative, anarchistic art project, right? More or less. And then you can go further in history and you can talk about the tendency that originated in Germany, but this tendency was specifically about how it was a specific way of proposing how to address the Treaty of Versailles. So that was actually a position Lenin addressed in left-wing communism and infantile disorder. I mean, ironically, right? He's addressing National Bolshevism in his book that's a critique of the ultra-leftist. But I agree with Lenin on that position, however, that there could be no question that there couldn't be an alliance with a big industrial bourgeoisie of Germany against the Treaty of Versailles, right? So, but beyond that, I really don't. I'm not really too familiar with what's called National Bolshevism beyond that context. I don't really know what would separate it based on the way you described it from an orthodox Marxist-Leninist position.
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things is, were I living in Russia right now, I would most likely just be a member of the Russian Communist Party, which of course is a Marxist-Leninist party. Or if I was Chinese, I would be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. But here in the United States, as Caleb Maupin has identified, I think very accurately, the concept of the synthetic left has really perverted, with the exception of just a few voices out there in the wilderness, what Marxist-Leninism really is. So for me, having that element of affirmative identity, which wasn't a question, like if you go back to the 1960s with the original Rainbow Coalition that was founded by Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party, they worked with the Young Patriots organization, which as they were combating the issues of police brutality and they were combating the imperialism of the Vietnam War, you had guys who were there in their leather jackets and their berets and the Black Panthers next to Appalachians that were wearing Confederate battle flags that had their own affirmative ethnic identity, but that didn't break any form of solidarity. And I mean, that's why the FBI said that the Rainbow Coalition and Fred Hampton were more dangerous to the American way of life, which is capitalism and imperialism, were more dangerous than the Soviet Union and China at the time. So for me, do I have inspirations, obviously, from National Bolshevik thinkers, like Ernst Nietzsche and others? Yes. But in the modern context, it really is just a way of also identifying that one can be a socialist and a communist that's separate from like CPUSA or DSA, the DSA who just held a vote that, one of their congressmen is okay with Israeli apartheid and war crimes, but he can stay. But, heaven help if someone in the DSA were to accidentally misgender someone, then, obviously they've got to go. We don't really have a serious socialist movement in the United States. So it's a way of kind of separating, instead of having to dig through for hours of what you mean by socialism isn't, numerous culture war issues that have nothing to do with socialism. And instead it's, I have an ethnic identity, which is fine. It's not to the detraction of any other ethnic identity or group. And I'm actually a socialist because right now the American left is very, very sad.
Specifically, when it comes to applying socialism to the American context, it's kind of strange to me that one would use the term National Bolshevism, because this is a term that, I mean, the word Bolshevism obviously it's a Russian name, Bolshevik, right? Also, another thing that seems a little strange to me is the national aspect, because the national question as applied to the United States is actually a very difficult and ambiguous question. It's one that I've personally struggled with a lot. I'm not really convinced that, for example, people within Appalachia constitute a different ethnos, right? A specific ethnos. It seems there's a specific black ethnos, right? Specifically, we could see the Black Panther Party and so on represent that. And to be fair, a lot of people don't know this, but when Huey Newton was confronted with the question of how can white people support the Black Panther Party, he actually said you should form your own White Panther Party, right? So,
Yeah.
but still, I think this is a simplification because I don't really think white people in the United States constitute a unique ethnos beyond being defined negatively, right? Separate from all those who fall outside of this characteristic. Like, it seems to be a word for one who is already kind of entwined with institutions, right? The more institutionalized and socialized, the more one falls into this kind of cultural category, right? Which is why there's actually more similarity between rural white people and black people than there is between black people and white liberals in the city, because the city white liberals are like, they epitomize all of the features one associates with whiteness, right? And very stiff, frigid, politically correct. But to me, I think it's very important not to fall into the era of anarchism, right? I don't believe one should define themselves purely on the basis of opposing. For example, opposing the left. I myself oppose the American left and so on and so on, but I'm not willing to concede that they correctly represent the international left within the United States, that they correctly import the insight of the experience of communism and socialism in the United States. And that's why, for example, it's been a great source of conflict between me and them, even more in some regards than the way that they're going to be in conflict with like outright rightists. Like the fact that I do remain committed to the orthodox Marxist-Leninist project has created more antagonism with these leftists in the United States than if were I to just be some kind of right winger. So I don't think it should be conceded to them. I think we should not take for granted these categories of left and right. What if it really is a synthetic left, and that the question of communism in the United States is an open question? What if they don't represent communism in the United States? What if it's completely different? If it were to be, if the correct insights of the communism elsewhere was applied to the United States, we should have, and by we I mean everyone who remains committed to a communist project but opposes American left, should have a degree of indifference toward leftists. Who cares about them? They're a tiny minority of the population, right? They seem intimidating because they gang up together and they attack people and they, whatever, on Twitter and on social media. But in the grand scheme of things, they're not really that significant. So the question of building communism in the United States, I think, remains open question. Now, regarding DSA, I think it's a completely irredeemable, bankrupt organization. But as far as the Communist Party is concerned, I'm currently wagering that there's some kind of possibility of reforging the party, right? Specifically by bringing in people who are more representative of the working class within the party, right? But we'll see how that turns out. But I guess that's all I have to say for that.
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things is the question of a white identity. And, for myself, when I did my 23andMe and my family genealogy and traced back to where my ancestors came from, it was to southern Germany and to Ireland. And I've been to southern Germany, I've been to Ireland. And while I can see elements of my family there, even if I spoke fluent German, I wouldn't be able to be airdropped into Bavaria and be a Bavarian, right? Like I couldn't just go live in a small Irish village and be 100% Irish. And my identity as a white person was formed through ethnogenesis here in the United States. So, understanding ethnicity is part of the human experience. And like you mentioned, with Black Americans, for instance, that they came from dozens of tribal groups, national groups, taken against their will to this country, and they formed over the last several centuries their own unique identity. And that's why, for instance, after the Civil War, freed slaves going back to Liberia and stuff like that, they didn't just integrate into the West African experience. They still had a lot of their own ethnic identity. So I think it's important that we positively affirm who we are and work then in an American context and develop that. Because, I mean, here in the United States, we see the power that racial divide has been levied against everyone. And the first laws that were passed to divide the working class in this country on the basis of race were after Bacon's Rebellion, right? When white indentured servants and black slaves realized that they had a lot more in common in terms of material conditions against the planter class. And that's where we see the introduction of dividing the working class. But that doesn't mean that the identities aren't there and that they aren't important. So I think having that as part of our explicit platform, that it's okay to be whoever you are and to be proud of your heritage, not to the point of chauvinism where you look down or divide from other people, but we need to uphold the right of self-determination that Lenin, Marx, even James Connolly, Irish Republicans like that, upheld the right of self-determination. I mean, even the Communist Party in the 1920s supported the creation of an independent black state in America, because I'm not really an American. Because like this question is like, what is America? And I would say it's essentially a continental shopping mall, right? Like it's one big company town that for one reason or another, all of us are here. So I don't think clinging to an American identity really makes sense, but we have developed unique ethnic identities, and we're all members of the working class and need to be able to find ways to fight against capitalism and imperialism when we're stuck in this asylum being run essentially by absolute psychopaths that hate all of us and exploit all of us. So I think that's why identity is important. And I am a white person, like that just is what it is. I'm not a German. I'm not an Irishman. I am white. And how can we decolonize whiteness from being tied to the systems of oppression the American empire has created? And, what the modern American left says is like, well, then just stop having an ethnic identity. And, this is my family. It's part of my heritage. And, also I think issues of faith are very important. And that is really what motivates me, the concept of faith, family, and community. And then building with solidarity with other ethnic communities. And we've seen that it works in the United States. It just hasn't really been tried in the past 50 or 60 years due to government repression.
Well, the thing is that what is called white in the United States is not specific enough to encompass any kind of real ethnos. For example, as far as people's unique heritage and tradition is concerned, they're going to do that through their family. So here was my grandpa and his father and his father. They came from a ship and this date and this date. And there's nothing wrong with celebrating this unique heritage, right? This is something based in family. And maybe it's even based in geography in certain cases, right? There's probably parts of America where there's a village or a town of people primarily who came from Finland or something, right? So I don't see anything wrong with this. But the white identity does not compass a specific and unique ethnos, as far as I can see. And one of the evidence I have for this is that it's always changing, right? For example, the people who came fresh off the boat in Ellis Island, Italians, Irish, all these other kinds of non-WASP people, they were not considered white, right? But then through a process spanning decades and decades of these people becoming more embedded within the country, institutionalized, and so on, naturalized, so to speak, they suddenly have become white, right? So to me, the only thing that unites the so-called white identity within the United States is a fundamental embeddedness within United States as a state. So it is a fundamentally American identity. It's really just the American flag that's going to unite these various different people. Now, the reason why Black people will not be encompassed by that specifically can be actually traced historically, and this is kind of my materialist analysis, to the aftermath of slavery, in which they were not given an economic base that attaches them to some kind of loyalty to the state, with the 40 acres and the mule. Other peoples, for example, during the westward expansion, where they could just claim land with the Homestead Act, and then later, in the aftermath of World War II, with the housing reform after the New Deal, there was a loyalty that was secured to the state among the Ellis Island immigrants as well, right? So land is the central reason, basically, why the Black identity has not been integrated into the general American one. Also, it's also because Black is an umbrella term to refer to various different descendants of slaves from Africa, right? So there's also the aspect of Pan-Africanism that comes from Marcus Garvey and so on, and that kind of specific lineage. So black is not so much its own ethnic identity as much as it is a kind of repository of people who have a connection to Africa and want to embrace that specific connection. And the reason they have to make that distinct is because that is not something that has been made inherent in the American identity, which is mostly thus far, right, European in origin, right? Also, in the case of Latinos, the distinction, but even the distinction from white people becomes kind of very much hard to draw a line. There's different kind of syncretic communities of people mixed between white and Latino and so on when you get closer to the border of Mexico. So to me, I agree that we need to have a national question and that American identity, obviously by itself, does not suffice. But where I find it difficult to understand is how white people, the term white people, can constitute a nation. Now, when we say, for example, you are white, you, Matthew, you are white, all that basically means is you are not black, Latino, or someone who falls outside of this category, right? But what are you positively, in the positive sense of the word? You would have to consult your specific family background, your where you were born, where you grew up, things kind of like this will give an air of determinate positive form.
Well, I mean, I think one of the issues here is, I don't think black identity is merely the lack of having been integrated into American cosmopolitanism.
I agree.
It's its own identity. And the thing is that white Americans, we have the same general past. We have the same general future. If you're looking at politics and economics, we get the same cultural references. I mean, we've developed a unique culture. And it's not anyone else's place to erase my identity or have to define, like, is whiteness good enough? Just like it's definitely not my place to tell a black person that, well, is blackness even real? Identity is a personal thing within a community. And the thing is, everyone knows what a white person is. And I agree. Like I've been to Europe plenty of times, and whiteness exists as its own unique identity. It's not a catch-all term for every European from the Caucasus all the way to Argentina. It existed and developed in its own unique context, especially here in the United States. And the thing is, like, I mean, have you ever read White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg?
No, I haven't.
I heavily suggest it because, I mean, the thing is, Eisenberg traces from the first days of colonization up towards the modern period how white folks have been exploited by the capitalist system, but also throughout that, how we've developed our own forms of identity and community. So, I think instead of arguing, because, you can see this in, certain white nationalist circles, where the argument of like, well, who is white? What is white enough? And you see this from liberal circles about, is whiteness even an effective identity? I think it comes down to the individual and the communities that say, this is who we are, this is what our heritage is. And if we can affirm that, if people don't want to have the identity, then that's okay. Like if a black person, it has more connection with, for instance, a religious faith or something they have, and that's how they choose to identify, well, that's their right. All I'm saying is that for those of us who do hold this ethnic identity, well, that's a positive thing, and everyone should have a positive identity of whatever their choice is based on their history, and we can take that from there to work on the problems that are facing all of us.
But the problem for me is that white encompasses people with radically different histories, right? And
well, I mean, in Europe, I mean, like my Irish ancestors
so
and my German ancestors.
Yeah. So what you basically mean is white is basically in the United States, everyone of European descent is what you would say.
Well, I would say, I'm also an Orthodox Christian. So
Yeah.
I've been in plenty of churches where people who are Greek, people who are Serbian and stuff like that, and they've held on to language, culture, customs, and the identity of their homeland. So I would say that that person is a Greek person, or that is a Serb, or that is a Romanian, that it's through an ethnogenesis that whiteness was developed as an identity. It's not just a catch-all that anyone who happens to have the same amount of melanin as me is part of the group. It's an identity that was formed over time. That, like, my German ancestors were told that you had to learn to speak English. During World War I, a Lutheran priest was beaten nearly to death because he was giving last rites to a German woman in a hospital. So a lot of who we are in terms of our ancestral identities were stripped through the Americanization of our ancestors, but we have formed a unique identity. You can't go into the hills and hollers of West Virginia and not have a sense of culture and place and a people. And I think that's a positive thing. At no point during the labor movement struggles, with the United Mine Workers and stuff like that, was there a question about, is whiteness an identity or does it exist? It was simply said, whiteness does exist, blackness does exist, and you both are workers, and we need to fight the bosses together. And that's my position I'm coming from.
I agree that if you went to West Virginia, you would find all this, but the issue is that too much is encompassed by white. So, for example, you have to look at it also from the urban and rural divide. It seems to me that one becomes more white the more urban they are, right? But it depends on how one is defining whiteness in the first place. The way in which white is mostly defined, uh, in my understanding, and I could be wrong, is reflexivity, a sense of like acute reflexivity. Basically, that one defines the ground of their being based on some kind of institution or some kind of like consciously held premise. Like one reflexive, just in the sense that like one adopts this sense of it's typical, people will say purity, but just kind of pure form, right? And you can think of this in terms of political correctness. In politically correct culture, for example, one is in when they're using the right language and they're using the right mannerisms, and you're proving that you have a kind of reflexivity, right? Well, one is out when one's just being their authentic, normal, and plain self. Then one is completely excommunicated, right? So, interestingly, political correctness having an anti-racist veneer, it follows the pattern of whiteness as described, for example, by the theorists I'm familiar with. But this ethnogenesis, I think, does apply to specific peoples, like in Appalachia, for example. That is a good example of something like that. And then in the South, you have even a different, even in Texas and Louisiana, and with I forget what they're called, Cajuns or something like that.
Yeah, the Cajuns.
Cajuns, yeah. And then in Michigan, even where I live, you also have this kind of different communities. But I still struggle to see how this is one white nation or one white ethnos, right? Because to me, an ethnos cannot just be defined by what it is not. It has to have a particular substantive determinate reality. So what are some features you would identify of this supposed white ethnos that applies to all of these different peoples?
Sure. Well, I mean, as an example, I've spent a lot of my life, my adult life in Appalachia, but I've also lived in Pittsburgh. I've also lived in Michigan. It's a great state, beautiful state. I lived in Montana for a while, and for me, there was no question when I was in Pittsburgh, and all the guys I pretty much knew were Teamsters or iron workers or good working class folks with families. We went to church together. We shared a heritage. And were they from different parts of Europe originally than myself? At least some of them were. A lot of Eastern European immigrants and stuff like that. But we shared a cultural bond and an understanding from one another that it's very similar, as you can see in the Black American experience. Black folks in Michigan and Black folks in Georgia do have the same sort of basis of having developed a culture, and then of course, especially due to economic reasons, having to spread out. Like when I was in Montana, the local county had a southern barbecue they would hold every single summer, where folks after the war, they didn't have farms to go back to, so a lot of them started to go out west, and they kept part of their state heritage and stuff like that and their southernness. But it's also an expression of whiteness, where people that had no ancestors from the south came and participated in, and it was seen as a cultural event that everyone could participate in. And it's the same way, I think, with Black people in the United States. It's the same as we see the growing of the Hispanic identity, which is going to be separate than, some mere Latin American national identity that they're forming in the United States, their own unique identity through ethnogenesis. So I don't define whiteness by we're not black or we're not Latino or we're not American Indian. I do it by the fact that we have, shared culture, shared customs, shared language, and is one of the reasons we have shared culture because of the forced Americanization on our ancestors? Absolutely. But it would be silly for me to walk around in lederhosen or, to put on an Irish accent just because, my great great granddad had one. Instead, understand that my people are part of my identity. And we understand one another. So I mean, I've been all over the country, and there's lots and lots of white folks, even if they're from different European nations originally. We've developed our own culture, and I think that could be said for pretty much every ethnic group in the imperial United States.
So I understand when you gave me the example of the steel workers and so on, and how you have similar values and similar sentiments and so on, probably even similar activities like outdoors type activity, fishing and like pickup trucks and stuff. This is what I see in Michigan with rural people. So I get that, but my only issue is that I don't see whiteness as the essence of this specific. Also, I don't necessarily know if it can be a unique ethnos. If it is, then it's based on the specific relationship these people, I mean, you named it yourself, steelworkers have had with the American state as an institution. For reasons I mentioned before, the specific relation between the working class and the state through unions and so on, that was arrived at after World War II, right? And so here specifically, you find among these same groups of people non-white people. Now, are they a minority? Of course, there's always an exception or a minority, but they're still there. It's possible for people who are not of European descent to be part of this, right? Now, not as a community, right? Not as a majority, but it's still possible to become nativized as part of this specific cultural understanding, right? Who goes fishing and does all this kind of things. So there is a reason, specific reason why their majority are white people and white people of European descent. And like I said before, that issue goes back to the aftermath of slavery, right? Now, in the case of Latinos, you're either going to have a case where there's actually deep similarity between the Latino working class that has been here for like decades and decades and decades and the so-called white one. They're actually very similar, right? But other than that, the issue is just immigration, that they came here sooner, right? So that's really what's going to make them outside of this. Then in the case of slavery, you again had this inability for the state to cement the loyalty of the black population through land. Now, I'm not saying the black identity is only defined by this exclusion. So that should be made very clear. I don't mean to say that it's like only a form of kind of, this is something a lot of woke people, right? People say like it's all based only on oppression and all of the spirituals and songs and culture and so on. It's all just because of oppression. That's not true. There is a specific tradition and specific heritage there. But again, this separation specifically, I would attribute to that fact. Now, were it not for that separation, we would probably see maybe this is a hypothetical alternative universe, a completely different ethnos, right? It wouldn't just be that black people would be just like white people. There would probably be a completely new ethnogenesis, as you put it, corresponding to the universal American identity. Or maybe there would be a different outcome. But for what we can say as far as the current situation is concerned, it's specifically for that reason, right? It's specifically because of, and this is why my materialist analysis, because of their relation to their economic relation to the state as an institution.
Well, I mean, the thing is, just as an example, that Eskimos didn't know that they were Eskimos as a separate identity before a bunch of Europeans paddled up, right, and said that hey, by the way, you guys are this. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have an identity. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be defined by other groups. I mean, just talk to a European. Like, there's a time I was hanging out in a pub with some European comrades, and every time I talked, I would see the people across from me kind of go like that a little bit, and I stopped. I went like, am I loud? Like, I apologize. Everyone was quieter around me, and I'm a pretty loud, chatty guy in general. But they were like, yes, white Americans, you guys are. And a European can tell, even if you look German or look Irish or stuff like that, that you are, of a similar heritage, but you're part of a separate identity. And the thing is that as a white person in the United States, that we shouldn't have to have a duty to convince any other group that our identity is valid. It's real to myself and members of my community. And, in the American political system, like, you see Zionists, for instance, saying that, well, the Palestinian identity isn't legitimate. Actually, they're just Arabs. And here's all these reasons to justify the apartheid state of an occupation in Palestine. But, Zionists shouldn't have the right to invalidate a Palestinian national identity, just like any other community shouldn't have the ability to invalidate my own community's identity. And it's not a sticking point of division. It's simply part of who we are. And now it's where can we go from here to work together for common goals where we can all be proud of who we are and have a tie to our roots and our families and our heritage. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that, it's great to have these discussions, and I really enjoy them, but it's not anyone outside of the community, their place to define what is a valid identity and what isn't. Because, like, it would be, and even the idea that, like, whiteness is synonymous with hunting and pickup trucks and bad country music, I don't think that that's accurate. But you go into rural areas and you have a culture, but you can see whether it's what used to be in South Boston before it was gentrified. That was a unique identity that was in a purely urban context. I don't think whiteness is just the country perspective. It goes beyond that. I mean, like we were talking about, when I lived in Pittsburgh, that's an urban environment, and I didn't stick out as some sort of hillbilly from the sticks. I was just part of the community, and that's who we are. And then we can work from that to work to achieve political goals.
So the reason for that, just that last thing, is after modernity, the dynamic between rural and urban was no longer defined in the traditional sense between agrarian and cities, right? There was a kind of suburbanization. Sorry, how should I put it? Yeah, I guess suburbanization within the urban context that created a new rurality, right? So the working class within cities who work in factories and so on, they themselves, even if they're living in in Pittsburgh, they would be considered rural in the American cultural imagination, right? But regardless, the threshold of the urban-rural distinction is something historical. It changes over time. But my issue is that when we try to have a scientific analysis of the ethnogenesis in any country, moral, right, we see that the relationship to the state as an institution is definitive. It's a defining part of how an ethnos comes to be, because an ethnos is a way of collective being. It's a form of collective being. And the state is the universal institution that interpolates an individual as more than just themselves. But it doesn't only do this in some abstract or ideological sense. It does it in a material sense, in the form of the way the state relates to individuals economically, right? The state reproduces its material existence through the people that serve as its popular foundation, right? And that is specifically in terms of land or abstract economic space of some kind, right? So we can see in the United States that the white identity that you're talking about, why is it that if it is something separate from America, or at least not reducible to the ethnos of American state, why is its whole history and whole identity and so on, why can this all not, why is it that we can trace this to the specific relationship between the individual and the American state in general, just individual taken as like the ideal citizen of the American state. Like we can trace, for example, how this ethnos came to be, and it was through the American state. Like it is precisely the reason why Irish and Italians and Polish and all these kinds of people became white. It wasn't because they eventually came to an understanding with the WASPs. It was because of the specific new relationship between the universal American state and the individual that happened after FDR and World War II, right? So this is a question we have to answer. How is it that the category of white can expand? Well, the way I see it, I don't see another alternative explanation, is precisely because of this material analysis of the American state. And that's finally why you say that people who are outside of the community cannot like say, does it exist or does it not exist? But within that specific community of people you're talking about, I could be wrong, but the majority of them, while acknowledging that they're white in the sense that, yes, we're white, we're not black, whatever, when they define themselves positively and affirmatively, they really just end with American. Some may tack on the Irish or the Polish heritage or the Italian one, but at the end of the day, it is the American identity that they are the most loyal to, in my experience. I mean, I don't see the majority of white people in this country viewing the white identity as a political signal, a political identity, or even an ethnological identity around which to identify or rally themselves. It's just they just say, I'm an American. I'm proud to be an American, and that's what I am, right? And they even go so far as to say, when they express their rejection of Black Lives Matter or whatever, they'll say, why are they dividing us by race? We're all Americans, right? So this is something that has to be kept in mind. It's the American identity that the community you're talking about, like itself, the way I can see, I could be wrong, chooses as it's the banner under which to define itself, not whiteness.
Well, I mean, the thing is, first of all, states don't define ethnicity. I don't think that's ever been the case. Human beings are fundamentally tribal. That's part of the human experience. That's why even when they do studies on young children of all backgrounds, for instance, they can be triggered with a bigger response when a hand is put, in front of them, and it's pricked with a pin the closer it looks to them. That's not a white person thing. That's a natural thing that through evolution, human beings became tribal creatures. So that can either be used to be a negative and promote chauvinism or hatred or stuff like that, or we can just simply accept that that is a scientific reality of the human experience and work with it. Ethnicities have existed long before the modern concept of states, right? Or even the modern concept of nations. Tribalism has always been part of the evolutionary experience of every single person on the planet. And if the state, the American state specifically, causes ethnicity of this American identity, then why hasn't it managed to fuse together black folks, white folks, indigenous folks into one people when they've had centuries to do so? So, I would say the main relationship between the people in the United States, whether they're white folks, black folks, indigenous folks, whatever, it's based upon our exploitation. Essentially, it's not about creating an affirmative identity. America was founded by a bunch of capitalists that created these colonies, and they took the poor and impoverished of Europe, brought them over here, and they referred to them in some of the documents amongst the Virginia Company, referred to working class people as fertilizer, that we were to be brought here to work and to die and then make profits for people, many of whom never even came to the colonies. And I would argue that the American Revolution from the beginning wasn't based on any liberating principles. And, you can see that just by looking at the Whiskey Rebellion, which was led by Continental War veterans that said, hey, this whole thing was about no representation, and we're not going to be taxed if we don't have a voice. So what does George Washington do? He marches 13,000 troops in to Western Pennsylvania to murder farmers, many of whom were Continental War veterans, who were simply saying, hey, these are the supposed principles of our new republic. And I think going forward over the past 200 plus years, that's been the main relationship between every single group of people, especially, including white folks, that the state hasn't existed to create an identity. It's simply existed to bully us into being exploited. And it's capitalism in a turbocharged fashion, because at the very least in European countries, these national identities had time to develop from tribal identities into feudal fiefdoms, into the modern concept of a nation state, and so on. But the United States, it was founded to make money by rich people to use and abuse us. And in that context, blackness developed. In that context, whiteness developed separate from the state. And I think you would find the people that are most tied to their ethnic identities are those who are the most exploited. And they're the ones who have found a sense of community and identity amongst people like themselves.
Well, I don't mean to say that the state creates ethnicities in a voluntary sense, like, oh, we just want to be a universal state, and because it's a dialectic. The issue is, what does the state working with to begin with? It's working with already made ethnos. It had no say in determining or forming. So I agree, the state doesn't create ethnos, but the state is a fundamental part of the dialectic of ethnogenesis. Um, for example, if there's such a thing as the French ethnicity, this is only an ethnicity that was united by the common reality of all who would then become part of the category of French people, unified by the French Revolution. And it was specifically based on their loyalty to the French Republic, right? This is the making of France as a modern universal nation state. Before then, you did have an identifiable, ambiguous kind of French people, but it was far more localized and far more ambiguous in an ethnological sense.
Well, I mean, what I would just say to that is the French identity existed before the creation of the Republic. I mean, if you just look at Germans as an example, if you were particularly long lived and alive today
Yeah.
in 2021, you could have been born in a monarchy and been a monarchist, and then you could have been a social democrat, and then a national socialist, and then either a capitalist, if you're in West Germany, or a Marxist-Leninist if you're in East Germany, and now you might be like a Green Party member. And we've seen the changing of states, in just one lifetime, with 5 radically different conceptions of the state and political ideologies associated with it. But no one would really question that they're still Germans, right? I mean, even the German Communist Party, and their famous hymn, "Red Wedding," they say "Germany for the Germans," and that it betrays the idea that the German identity is not just built upon what state you're living in or what ideology is then being brought and in many cases forced on the people. It's an organic part of the human experience. So here in the United States, I mean, you could have lived as a colonist being ruled in a company town, and then you're part of the republic, and then you're once again living in a company town, right? And then we've got the issues of segregation, stuff like that. And America was defined by a majority ethnic identity until the 1965 Immigration Act. And now America is, as an identity, is like whatever you want it to be. Our diversity is our identity, which is the absence of an identity is the new American identity. So, I mean, I would just disagree that the American experience, our relationship as Americans, really had anything to do with the state. Places like Appalachia, as we've talked about before, were so rural in some places. Like you've got the blue people of Kentucky, where they had a genetic quirk where their skin, because there was a small amount of folks in the hills, they had actual blue skin, which is a fascinating thing if anyone wants to look at that, the blue people of Kentucky. But they weren't getting their sense of self from Washington, D.C. or New York or Philadelphia. It was from their local community, and they collectively identified as white.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the French people and the German people preceded the nation state corresponding to those. But before the French Republic, before the French Republic, this specific universal ethnos that cuts across all religious differences and all local differences did not exist, right? So the French people as a nation, I'm not saying they were created voluntarily by the state, but it is the state that epitomized their genesis as a nation, right? That makes sense because it's a dialectic point. It's a very subtle dialectic point that has to be understood. The raw material that creates the broader unity is not created by the form of that unity. I agree, but it's still inexorably a part of it. So I'm not saying Germany was only the German state or the Germany as a political entity, but statehood is an inexorable part of ethnogenesis, and specifically, religion is also an inexorable part of ethnogenesis historically, right? It's just that these things operate under a time span that's much, much longer, like centuries and centuries, than can be accounted for by individual ideologies and individual practices, right? It's just something that takes much, much longer. So and specifically the reason for that is, again, in the American context, the only thing that integrated Poles, Italians, what else, Irish, and so on and so on, as part of this as being white in the first place. I mean, do you think that there was something else besides the change in the nature of the American state and its relationship to the people? I mean, like, forget about the cause, right? Because that's also a dialectic relationship. It's like you can't just say the state caused it, because the reasons for the state changing in the way it did also was because of the nature of the people. But so it's a dialectic relationship. But how can you really understand how that happened outside of that process?
Well, because it's lived. I mean, the thing is my identity comes from my papa. It comes from, the ties where I can visit where my ancestors have been buried for hundreds of years. When I can go to North Carolina and see the battlefields that my ancestors fought on and some of them gave life for, it's not just an abstraction. My identity is a real thing that real people have lived, struggled, and died for. And we talk about the Irish. I'm half Irish. On me mother's side, it's pure Irish Catholic until you go back to the old country, and then it stays pure Irish Catholic. Like identity is a real lived thing that all human beings are grounded in. And the thing is that every identity we can work to try and pick apart, right? And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's accurate. I respect the positions you're bringing forward, but for me, accepting who I am and what I'm rooted in is, part of then my struggle for socialism for my family. I'm a father. I've got two young boys and I care about their future, and their heritage is part of it, but also the fact we're living in a society where the capitalist state wants to exploit them and use them for cannon fodder and imperialist wars and things like that. What's been told to me by large elements of the American left is my white affirming identity is not allowed in the conversation of socialism. So, I mean, I'm coming forward to simply say I am white. There's plenty of white folks who identify as white, plenty of people that maybe don't have a strong ethnic consciousness, and that's their own choice. But the real question is, are those of us who have an affirmative white identity, just like, the Panthers back in the day had an affirmative black identity, can we be part of the conversation about developing socialism for everyone? Because, the synthetic left says no. And this is a clear point that they've made. And also, if you disagree on any of their multitude of social issues, I'm not saying that's your position, but I mean, would you agree that having an affirmative white identity, and we can discuss whiteness and the history and the ethnogenesis for a long time, but to say here in 2021 that, hi, I'm a white person, I'm raising my kids to be white and to have that heritage and identity, can we be part of the conversation of socialism?
Well, look, obviously white people can, I mean, it's a no-brainer. White people are the majority of America. So any American socialism, of course, white people will be a part of it. But my gripe with this issue of white identity and white people as an ethnos specifically isn't so much because I want to have a sober materialist view of this. So I'm not speaking from an emotional or even so much ideological perspective. I'm just skeptical at the idea that this is actually objectively a real ethnos that could succeed in unifying the majority of even those who would be considered white in this country. Like, I don't see a context for the white identity beyond expressing some kind of grievance against non-white people. Like, are there manifestations of a affirmative white identity beyond, for example, like, we want to be separate from all these other kinds of people, we're sick of all these other kinds of people, and so on and so on. So to me, it's like, again, it goes back to the question. Of course, we all have a sense of identity and heritage that goes back to our father and our grandfather. But were it not for the change, for example, the fundamental change in the American state that happened, the causes of which we could talk about, Irish people and Polish people would not be considered white in this country. I mean, they would have been continued to be excluded in the same way they were before, and WASPs would be considered white Americans. And these immigrants who came from Ellis Island, having no way to become economically naturalized through the integration of the government, corporates, and unions, and so on, they would have been excluded from this kind of American project and would have been confined to some kind of subaltern existence. So we just have to evaluate objectively how the people you're describing came to be. And if we do that, I don't see how a white identity is what's essential. To me, what's essential is a specific relationship to the state. Now, does that mean the state caused this in the first place? No. It just means, and that's something that has to be investigated more broadly. But we do have to accept that these are people, by and large, who themselves choose to identify as Americans first and foremost, before anything, right? They are Americans. Now, it's only a small minority of white people who will then get into the kind of white pride stuff. Like, it's one thing to say, I'm proud to be an American. And there may even be an implicit understanding among some of these people that this is referring to people who are like me. In other words, white people. But, like, white pride is not something you find that's that commonplace among these same white people you're talking about.
I mean, I would politely disagree. In terms of having an affirmative identity, it's increasing amongst the white working class. This is part of our normal lived experience. And, I mean, one of the things, and I really appreciate, the hypotheticals and the historical discussion, and I'll jump back to that in a second. But I mean, what I want to know fundamentally coming forward is saying, like, hi, I'm a socialist, but I also have an affirmative white identity. And that is a core part of who I am. Are people who have an affirmative white identity allowed to be part of the socialist movement, or are only deracinated white folks that don't have an ethnic identity a part of it? Can you have an affirmative white identity and participate in the socialist movement? That's a yes or no sort of answer, in my opinion.
Well, I don't know what an affirmative. Well, there's two things, right?
Sure.
To me, there's no clear socialist movement that even exists in the United States, right? The one that, I don't know if you're referring to, like, a Twitter discourse or something like that. I don't consider that a socialist movement. So I don't think, if you're referring to a potential one, I have to ask what the practical implications are. What does the meat and potatoes of that mean? Because, for example, if there's no objective reality to a white ethnos, right? And that's obviously, white people exist. They're very clearly separately identifiable from other people. But is white an essential ethnos, like a specific substantive positive ethnic identity, or is it just an identity based on negation, pure negation?
Well, I mean, in terms of
if it's not, then someone who says, "Hi, I'm someone who identifies as white in the positive sense. Am I welcome?" I mean, to me, that would be no different than someone who says, "Hi, I'm a furry. I identify as my spirit animal is a wolf or something." Like, what would be the practical implications of that, right? At the level of a socialist movement. So we have to get to, first and foremost, because of course, a scientific I'm a Marxist-Leninist, right? So whatever country I live in, I'm going to try and arrive at a scientific view of the national question within the country. It's not based on individual preferences or individual identities. It's based on understanding, because as Stalin pointed out, nations are a material thing. They may not be as discrete as we'd like them to be for purposes of simplification, but there's a material reality to nations. There's also a material reality to ethnos, as even Soviet and Chinese ethnographers would point out, right? And knowing what kind of ethnos predominates in the United States is a very important question, and what kind of nations exist within the United States, or even what nationhood is in the American context, is a very important question for communists. But I'm just not convinced, for practical purposes, right? Not purposes of excluding or including arbitrary personal identities, but for practical purposes of working in this country, I'm not convinced there is a white ethnos or a white nation.
Well, I mean, do furries have to scientifically prove that their identities don't exist in opposition to non-furs? I mean, honestly, you're far more likely to find a place in the Communist Party USA, or especially the DSA, if you're a furry rather than a white person that has a tie to your history. But I mean, the thing with this, going back to the 1960s, and I really do believe that the Rainbow Coalition was the strongest example of what can be achieved through solidarity. And, if you look at the propaganda of the Young Patriots, along with the Panthers, they didn't have a question about whiteness. The Young Patriots were white. They wore Confederate battle flags as their symbol. There was no question that whiteness existed. I mean, even Mao in the Little Red Book, he specifically talks about how white people, the ones that did oppression, were the plantation owners and the capitalist class, and judgment should not be levied against the white proletariat. Instead, we should look for solidarity. So even Mao understood that white people exist as their own separate group, and we have to divide the proletariat from the capitalist class. The Black Panthers, as an example of a truly revolutionary socialist and internationalist movement, understood that white people existed, and they were willing to actively ally with people that, during the 1960s, having a Confederate battle flag as the battle over, desegregation stuff was happening, that's sort of controversial. But they were able to say, look, this is a part of your heritage and your sense of self as white folks, and we're going to work together and have our symbols. So, I mean, I would just say, looking from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, when do we see the example of even arguing, does whiteness exist, until we get to this modern, post 2016 sort of context, or dudes that read Settlers? Historically, if Mao thinks white people exist, if the Panthers think white people exist, and white people think white people exist as a separate, unique identity, then I feel like that pretty much settles the issue. And even if you don't accept that as legitimate identity, I don't have to persuade you to say that that's a part of who I am in my community. And if we spend all of our time debating over whether whiteness is a valid ethnography, I really think that gets in the way, just like debating over culture war issues, of the issues of socialism that are facing us. And I think this has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate how thoughtful you've been, and I've appreciated you letting me respond. But the thing is, we haven't talked about the means of production to the working class, and it's been an hour because we're questioning whether my ethnic identity is legitimate. And I think that there's bigger fish to fry, because not everyone has to agree that everyone's identity is a-okay. We can find common ground then to work on.
Well, I don't deny white people exist. They obviously do exist. And obviously, communists are not in the United States, are not going to be against people for being white. I mean, white people are the majority of this country, so it's not a strategy that would work, even from a cynical perspective. But my only point is it an identity around, which a reflexive, right, identity can be formed? What are the political and so on implications? I don't now this, I'm speaking in terms of my personal whatever preference. I really personally don't care if an individual identifies as white and views there to be a specific white history. And I mean, I don't care. That's just an individual. But for an organization, what does that mean? For a party, what does that specifically mean? Does it mean, for example, like why I brought up the case of furries is not because I think that it's precisely because in the case of furries, what are the practical implications? You can't prove furries are an ethnos or a nation specifically, right? So what does that become beyond some kind of personal idiosyncrasy? And so that's basically my question. Like, how can this be something beyond a personal idiosyncrasy? I doubt that the majority of white people would decide to identify as white in a political or cultural or even national or ethnographic sense, rather than calling themselves American to the core, right? Red-blooded Americans. I mean, this is what they have chosen to identify themselves as. Now, I think the American project uh, is a project of civilization building. So to me, I wanted to be more inclusive of other peoples, specifically the Indians or indigenous people, in the politically correct term, the Latino people, and so on and so on. But as it stands, this is what has This is what has, as far as I can see, made white people white. Not a reflexive white identity, but something more fundamental.
Well, I mean, what I would say, the idea that whiteness only exists in opposition to others, I mean, places like Appalachia, they are, I mean, you've got entire counties and parts of the region that have always been 100% white. I mean, since, the regions were settled by, folks like us. But they have affirmative regional identities, cultural identities, and racial identities. I mean, the pearl clutching that's happened since the 2016 election about specifically these regions or places in the so-called Rust Belt, that it shocked everyone that the idea of racial appeals and stuff like that spoke to people that for generations had been blue dog Democrats and part of the solid blue wall, but they had an ethnic identity, and that exists outside of the other, because in a lot of these places there is no other, it just is. These communities have developed everything from Appalachian granny magic, which essentially is a folk medicine, to music. I mean, one of my good buddies in the Traditionalist Worker Party, he makes musical instruments, right there, that the way his daddy did, his granddaddy did, and so on. And the music they play is part of that culture. Even things that might seem a little strange, going to Appalachia, and sometimes folks handle snakes at a Baptist church, or a Pentecostal church. It's unique elements of culture that developed locally that isn't in opposition to the other. But I mean, the thing is, at the end of the day, what this means is we reject the critical race theory that's being put forward by the modern left, that fundamentally argues that white people are somehow A, illegitimate, B, guilty of the sins of capitalism that's been transplanted onto the white working class, and fundamentally bad. And the thing is, in this conversation, talking about socialism going forward, I'm not asking for whites to have a special role. I'm actually asking for the opposite of that, to be able to stand as equals with other ethnic communities that already have their own affirmative identities. I don't want more or less legitimate. I just want everyone to have the ability to have an affirmative, legitimate identity where we can respect one another.
I'm going to let Haas respond to that, and then we're going to get into the Q&A. So if you wanted to.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I don't think white people are devoid of culture. I just don't think, and this is my view, that whiteness is the essence of those specific local cultures, because they differ regionally and they differ based on the people. Right? Appalachians are not the same as Cajuns, right? In terms of those traditions, in terms of that specific culture. And finally, as to the final point, I think this should simplify it, I guess. I don't think it does a communist movement good to have white people feeling guilty all the time, because communists are supposed to be warriors, they're supposed to be fighters, and they're supposed to be winners. And we were going up against the class enemy, we're going up against enemies. So to have a bunch of people who are weak and apologetic all the time, I don't think that helps anyone. Just speaking personally, I think it's much more productive if people from white backgrounds, uh, you know, we all maintain a position of mutual respect, not overstepping our bounds as it regards interference into other people and other people's business, not being disrespectful, but just maintaining, a sense of dignity and a sense of, you know, I definitely agree that there's something really fake, if this is what you're referring to, I guess, about the way in which white liberals and white leftists are always, acting like they're so apologetic and so repentant. It's kind of a feature of, I guess, a religious leftover and feature. But at the same time, I think that like a kind of white pride or white nationalism is just the opposite side of the coin of that very same pathology, which is fundamentally unable to just get over whiteness. I think like whiteness is just something that, as an identity, like shouldn't really be on. I don't see it as something that has to be on the back of people's minds all the time. The way I see it is that the most prominent communist fighters in the history of the United States who were white, they were focusing on bigger things. They were focusing on America and the American people. I mean, maybe if they came from Irish backgrounds or Polish backgrounds, they were focusing on that specific community. But I mean, their minds were not on that, right? And to me, I think it's an attempt to kind of just be the opposite of what the white leftists and the white liberals are, which is this kind of self-hating and permanently guilty kind of posturing. But I think it's just the other side of the same coin that might actually very well lead to the same outcome, right? We should focus first and foremost on, first of all, the struggle of the American working class, America, and then we should also be attentive to the national questions that need to be addressed, right? Lenin was a Russian, right? Because there was a Russian civilization. But he was also attentive to the national question in the Russian Empire concerning the national minorities and that whole thing, right? So I think we have to have something similar here in America. We have Americans. Most Americans are white, not all of them. Most people who identify primarily as Americans, above all, are white. Again, not all, but we can have that American civilization or that American identity, but we need to be attentive to this other pressing national question in this country as well. So that's my position on that overall.
Sure. Well, just to respond real quick, I know we need to get to the questions. I
Mhm.
mean, the thing is, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I can be white and have that as part of my identity and build socialism simultaneously. And, the idea of national liberation struggles has been common, especially amongst oppressed groups in the United States. And, just to the point that, the idea of whiteness wasn't kind of a foundation of identity in some of the regions we've been discussing. There's a reason the bosses brought in workers of color into areas like Appalachia, or Henry Ford brought black workers that were dispossessed and pushed out due to the boll weevil epidemic and the Great Depression into places like Detroit, right? Because at the end of the day, he knew that ethnic strife and differences and stuff like that would make organizing harder of the working class. Now, I don't think these lines should be able to stop us from working together, but the idea, Fred Hampton specifically said that he believed in black power, he believed in white power, he believed in yellow power, he believed in red power, all power to the people. And that's part of this concept of building socialism, building solidarity, building internationalism, and building a better future for all of us here in what's known as the United States, with identity at the bedrock of that. So that's merely my position. And if race didn't play into an element of identity in the regions we've been discussing, the bosses wouldn't have used forced diversity to try and stop unionization. They would have just thought, oh, these are just, this isn't going to be a big deal. But that's a reason why here in 2021, Amazon specifically targets to curtail their workforce to be as diverse as possible. It's not because they love diversity, but because they've done studies and shows that ethnic tensions and things like that reduce unionization efforts. So the thing they were doing 100 years ago in Mingo and in Welch, West Virginia, Jeff Bezos is doing today. And that's why accepting identity is important. It's affirmative. And to pretend it just doesn't exist, like, only white Americans are being asked for this erasure, that we got to put all of our identity to the side and we got to just build socialism for everyone. No other ethnic group is asked for that. And I don't think we should ask them for that. Instead, we should all have an affirmative identity and build socialism together. But anyway, that was my final thought on that.
All right, so I'm going to start reading some of the questions and super chats. All right, so from Chris, thank you for the super chat. He said, Matthew, your concept of white is determined by the negation of what white liberals want you to be. Why are you falling into this trap?
Well, I don't believe that my concept of self and my family's concept of self is based on anything that white liberals want. We've existed as a people for hundreds of years, and outside of any white liberals promoting things like white guilt and the mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa that they love to do for MSNBC and CNN and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with my lived experience and the experience of my children and my extended family. So I don't believe that my identity is based on the negation of any other identity or any other group. And I don't believe it's being defined to me, because if I was going to go along with what white liberals wanted, then I would just go ahead and be a cartoon supervillain. Like, I would embrace neocolonialism. I would embrace white supremacy, because that's what white liberals fundamentally think in a classist, just horrific way towards the average white proletarian. And so I reject those things. I reject the framework they've established and instead support solidarity.
But don't you kind of think that, like, even the kind of terms you're using, aren't those a little bit similar to how white liberals speak, like lived experience and isn't this kind of a feature of the kind of new kind of liberal individualism in our society? Or
No, I mean, I don't think so, because again, going back hundreds of years, it's how we identified. I mean, the first immigration law to the United States limited immigration to white persons. So even the argument that, for instance, like, well, the Irish weren't white, or the Polish weren't white, or the Italians weren't white. Well, even when the immigration laws of the United States limited immigration to white persons, they were allowed in. So obviously there has always been a white identity since literally the very beginning of the American Republic. Now, I'm opposed to white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism, obviously, but the idea that this is a newfangled term that they just came up with, I don't believe is accurate from a
no,
historical view.
I know the white category has always existed, but it's like the way that it kind of seems you're interfacing with it is very similar. It's just very reminiscent of a kind of liberal or neoliberal individualism, where it's like, what really is the point beyond having something with which to individually, the reason for this identity politics and individualism is career climbing. That's why it's so individualistic. It's like, well, this is my specific lived experience, and it's used as a form of personal capital. So it's just kind of strange when you see that take that form of, like, it kind of seems like, and I don't think you're doing this consciously, but I think like the practical implication would be like, I want to use the white identity as a form of personal capital, right? But I think that the paradigm of individual personal capitals we use to career climb is fundamentally anti-communist. I mean, even when we respect, for example, I do have respect for black nationalism and so on, but that's not a matter of like a personal individualistic identity politics. It's a collective project for a discretely identifiable people, right?
Well, I mean, I promise there's no social capital in taking an affirmative
No, I know,
identity in the
but
United States.
it seems like, for example, you're coming at a perspective of wanting one, right? And that's the source of the unfairness you perceive. But I don't think it's unfair. I think the social capital existing in the first place is fundamentally individualistic and neoliberal. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I would politely disagree, because I would say it's fundamentally collective and communal. It's the white capitalists that have no sense of identity, just like any capitalist doesn't, right? Their identity is green. Their identity is one another to exploit working people. So the idea of having an ethnic identity is actually a communal sort of perspective. And we've seen this amongst, communist movements and socialist movements throughout history. The national question of Ho Chi Minh or of even the Soviet Union was never a question. So no, I think it's a rejection of individualism. It's a rejection of the liberal establishment, and instead is trying to bring our sense of community back, that then we can organize class consciousness within.
Okay, so from Black Lennon, thank you for the super chat. It said, question for Matthew. Do you believe in the labor aristocracy? What are your thoughts on it? Do you deny it? I'm interested to hear your answer.
Well, I mean, if we're to talk about the managerial class and stuff that exists, I think at the end of the day, the labor aristocracy really comes down to there are capitalists and there are proletarians. And we've really muddied the water in especially the service economies of the West and things like that, to where thinking that like your supervisor, because he might get higher wages or things like that, is somehow a boss, totally misunderstands what socialism is and what capitalism is. Like, if you're a temporarily disadvantaged millionaire, which unfortunately is the perspective of a lot of Americans, right? There's a great book, It Didn't Happen Here, which kind of discusses why socialism never was able to fully take root in the United States as it did in a lot of European, Asian countries. I think that there's a misunderstanding of what the capitalist system and the capitalist economy is. And that's really been a point of division. Like, the enemy is not your boss on like at the local McDonald's or like the local factory. It's the guy that owns the means of production.
Okay, thank you. And from Chris, thank you for the super chat. It said, Matthew, why do you sound like an intersectionality seminar with different semantics?
I don't know, maybe it's I spent too much time in grad school, I guess. No, but I mean, the thing is working to explain these concepts, that I think that there's a lot we see in modern academia and the modern media that their final analysis and their takes are wrong, but they bring up a lot of interesting points that we can apply and adapt. I mean, socialism and Marxist-Leninism is a scientific process of understanding the world around us and where we're developing and going. So, you take what you can from all sides in a scientific and thoughtful way, and then apply that to your current circumstances.
Okay. And now from Patty Vandal, thank you for the super chat. Hey Matt, do you know how Patty T is doing? I'm guessing this is a troll question, huh?
No, 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 no. Patty
What?
Charlton. He was speaking of
Okay.
white culture. He was a folk musician that turned out some amazing albums from within the Traditionalist Worker Party, and he was grounded as a folk musician in that sphere. Went his family going back hundreds of years and adapting a lot of old tunes and stuff like that to a modern political context. I don't actually know how he's doing. Haven't spoken to him in several years, but I do think his work was an example of kind of a unique take on a cultural expression.
From Gulamero Escobar, I don't know. Thank you for the super chat. I said, explain why Jews aren't white Americans, even though they were white under the Naturalization Act of 1790.
Oh, well, I mean, that's easy. They have their own ethnic identity. That even if, for instance, you're a secular Jew, which most Jews are, that most Jews are rooted in their own religious and ethnic heritage and concepts. That regardless if you're a Polish Jew or a German Jew or something like that, and even if you don't practice your religion, that you see amongst these communities, you can be as secular as the day is long, but you're still then rooted in your ethno-religious identity. So just because, and that's an important to understand, whiteness is not about melanin. Whiteness is about a shared cultural history and identity. And if you were, well, maybe a German, and we might get into some controversial topics, but let's say a French. Like, if you're French, and you could be a French Jew, and you've got a tie to your own, Jewishness and identity that is separate from the standard French identity. And you come to the United States, you're still Jewish, just like someone who comes here and is Algerian. He's might have an American passport, but he's still gonna be an Algerian. He has a tie to his community, and so do Jews, even if they're secular.
But besides the, I mean, besides the religious background, and being secular and Jewish doesn't erase that religious background. Like, for example, there's a lot of secular Muslims, but they're still fundamentally different than Christians, right?
Agreed.
But I don't see Like if you ask black people, if you ask Latinos, if you ask non-white people in America, Jews are fundamentally white. I mean, I don't see how you can't. I mean, they're just as white as Italians or Poles or anyone else. That's how they're considered. I mean,
Right, and this is important, but it's not how they consider themselves. And we can see that with, for instance,
well,
the creation of the Zionist occupation in Palestine. Even if they are white in some of the conceptions of American history, they themselves do not identify with that unique ethnic identity and the cultural and often religious trappings that come with that. They identify as Jews, and that's why American Jews overwhelmingly support the Zionist occupation and Israeli apartheid, and they're tied to their roots. So it's not just about skin color; it's about
no, I know,
self-identification and
but
history.
but culturally speaking, and I don't really know if they don't consider themselves white just because Israel exists. But regardless, culturally speaking, they're they are considered not because of how they look, but because of the similar culture. They're considered white by black people and by Latinos and by other non-white people. They're not seen as like somehow non-white or outside white.
I mean, I would disagree. I mean, just
Like in the same way that Italians are, right?
well, no, I mean, even look back to Malcolm X, for instance. I mean, Malcolm X was very vocal about the fact that in Harlem and places in the black community, that he didn't talk about white folks owning the liquor stores and white folks, working to attack
Yeah.
the black nationalist movement.
What right. But even in that context, when he was singling them out, it's because he viewed them as a type of white people, and actually the at the time and even to this day, like many black nationalists who are referred to as anti-Semitic, if you hear what they say, that's actually what they think. They believe that American Jews are a type of white people. They are white, right? Now, there might be anti-Semitism where they're being singled out in some cases, but not insofar as they're seen as non-white.
See, I
Like,
disagree. I mean, and the example of the Nation of Islam is a great one, actually. I mean, on the secret relationship between blacks and Jews, it's a 3-volume historical set that's been put out by the Nation of Islam. And they very clearly argue in all 3 volumes with a tremendous amount of historical research that they don't lump Jews and white people in together. And volume 1 specifically focuses on the slave trade, how there was an overrepresentation in slavery in terms of owning the slave ships and the exploitation of black people, literally making profits that built capitalist America off
again, they may distinguish them, but they're still considered a type of white people. Maybe a unique type of white people, but they're still considered white.
I mean, I don't think so. Looking at the writings of black nationalists and black socialists, even that they've ever conceived of that.
Actually, that's very same kind of anti-Semitism that's coming from the some, not all, black nationalist writings, is precisely because American Jews are identified as white. Like that's actually the reason why. It's like it's part of the broader kind of mythos, for example, that like white people were created from the mad scientist Yakub and so on, and like this whole thing, right? And the anti-Semitism is just that they include Jewish people within that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, if you look, Somalians could be considered black by white Americans, right? But black folks, here in the United States, and Somalians themselves would reject that identity. So just
Well,
because,
actually, it's interesting. I don't mean to cut you off, but there is a whole new movement, and there is a degree of reality to it of American descendants of slaves who consider themselves totally separate from all African, not totally separate, but consider themselves like you can't just say we are all black. Like there's clearly a difference between black Americans and other African peoples in general, not just Somalis, right?
well,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, but I guess my broader point would, and that's not the Nation of Islam and so on, people. But I guess my broader point would be with that is that that calls into question whether the American notions of race in the first place have any credibility or objectivity, whether white, black, and so on and so on.
Well, I mean, I would say that in this specific example, it just goes to show that identity, whether it's whiteness or blackness or your Somali heritage or whatever it is, comes from self. That just because if you look and you see someone, you go like, ah, that's a black man, right? And it's like, well, actually, I'm Nigerian and I have my affirmative Nigerian identity and all this storied history, or I'm Ethiopian or stuff like that. It's not my place as a white person to say, "Oh no, no, you're just black," right? No, just like it's not the place of if someone is from South Africa and they say, "Oh well, blackness isn't real. You should be Igbo or you should you are Zulu." Like, well, no, it's not their place to determine the identity either. It's an internal intergroup, intercommunity perspective on self. So just because if some groups were to say, "Oh well, Jews are white because they're light skinned," I don't think that speaks to the Jewish belief on themselves as a tie to as an ethno-religious community, and I don't think it really matters one way or the other what people outside of the community say the community is, because it's a self-identification based on shared concepts and history.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but people who are in Italian families or Polish families, they're rarely going to like go out of their way to identify themselves as white. But when push comes to shove, right? Especially when they're put in specific context with non-white people, they're going to be like, "Yeah, we're white," So
See,
actually, very few Americans in general are just going to like primarily identify themselves as white is the thing. Like they're going to only consider themselves white given the right context, but otherwise they're either Americans or they're Appalachians or they're Cajuns or they're Poles or they're Irish and so on and so on.
I mean, I disagree. I was dating a Greek gal in college, and her daddy eventually decided, like, you are not part of our ethnic community, and you can't see
Yeah,
my
yeah,
daughter anymore, right?
precisely.
Yeah. So
But in another
they identified as
context,
Greek.
but in another context, they may identify or see themselves as white.
I mean, but I really don't think that when you look at their religious expressions, their cultural expressions, that isn't accurate. And I mean, I would encourage you. Maybe it'd be a fun, wacky road
I
trip.
think it's I
To,
think
to
it's only inaccurate insofar as they're different from the majority of white people in the United States. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't share in quality the quality of whiteness, right? So it's a question of what the essence of these different peoples are, and I think that's where our main dispute is. But we can actually move on. I know we're kind of
Yeah, and so Guli, I don't even know how to say that. He said, I think if it's super chat, he said, "Why do Jews identify as white on the census?"
why do people identify as Negroes still on the census? Like, I don't think the American Empire's definitions of putting people into boxes speaks in any capacity to what the lived experiences of working families is and how those communities determine who they are and who their children are.
And then Nathaniel, thank you for the super chat. He said, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" I mean, I'm guessing it's kind of like a little bit of a troll question. I'm not sure he's really asking that.
was it addressed to someone or
No, it was
oh.
just kind of a thank you for the super chat. We have quite a few. So wait, Zoltanis says, and thank you for the super chat. Zoltanis is the one who kind of got this whole debate going. So thank you very much for that. But he said, ask both of them what they think about Maoist rebel news and his fallout for mods.
I'll let you take that one to start.
Yeah, I think Jason, unfortunately, I tried to be cordial to him. I tried to be polite to him and respectful. He is going down a downward spiral and completely making a fool of himself across the board. All I could say is, I genuinely hope he puts an end to what he's doing and seeks some help because it's quite embarrassing at this point, but that's it.
I don't follow a whole lot of internet feuds, so I have no particular comment on that. But to jump back to the previous super chat that I do have an opinion on, Arabs identify as white on the census too, and they obviously have their own ethnic identity. So I think the American census system is just fundamentally broken because obviously there's a distinct history that Arab folks have, and often religious differences and things like that. And it's a policy of erasure that the American Empire does to real ethnic and cultural and religious identities. So, no opinion on the feuds, though.
All right. Ones that I can pull up. Thank you for this super chat from Jan. Says, doesn't white socialism obfuscate class consciousness in general in America?
Do you want to start with that, or do you want me to take it first?
I mean, I guess I guess the question is for you because I'm not pro white socialism, right?
Fair,
So,
fair enough. Well, I mean, the thing is I don't view it as white socialism specifically. I view it as socialism that involves white people. Just like I don't think having an affirmative Black identity or Latino identity or Arab identity or indigenous identity gets in the way of class consciousness, because obviously in the capitalist system, the proletariat, we do have class similarities. We have a shared class struggle. And I don't think affirmative identity gets in the way of that. I actually think it tries to empower us, because the capitalist system wants to break down all of our identities. And I'm very critical of Chomsky, so don't take this as I'm endorsing Noam Chomsky. But he had a very valid point when he argued that capitalism begins as racist, as that's a way to exploit people's labor and their resources, but it fundamentally becomes anti-racist insofar as it's anti-human, because human differences, cultural differences, religious differences get in the way of capitalism. Like, the capitalists want to be able to sell beer in Saudi Arabia and pulled pork sandwiches to make some profit. They want to be able to, open up liquor stores in dry counties in Tennessee, because that gets in the way of capital and making profit. So, for me, I don't think white socialism is anything other than white people who participate in the socialist movement.
From Chris Morlock, thank you for the super chat. He said, no one cares about white identity outside of people who hate white liberals telling them that they can't have this identity. I'm not sure if it was a question, but thank you. And then another one from Chris Morlock. Thank you for the super chat. He said, Matthew, you seem to be LARPing as a Marxist-Leninist and trying to sublate our clout, but we specifically reject nations, especially nation states, being solely based on race or tribe. Genes are fake.
Well, if we get into the argument that genes and science are fake, I don't know what there is to talk about. But, when James Connolly, as a Marxist and as one of the founders of the International Workers of the World, when he, helped write and signed the Irish Declaration of the Irish Republic in 1916, he specifically talked about the Irish nation having liberation. If you look at the writings of Ho Chi Minh, that said that patriotism motivated him initially, not socialism or communism. It speaks to the national character that has always existed. And Marxist-Leninism has held up the principles of the nation. I mean, during World War II, during the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union, of course, they were fighting for socialism against the fascist invasion, but they were also fighting for the Rodina. They were fighting for the motherland. And on your pass cards in the Soviet Union, your ethnic identity was put on that. And celebrations were held in the Soviet Union and in modern China and things like that to celebrate all the ethnic communities that existed in a union of fraternal peoples. That it didn't say just a union of workers who happen to exist in these various flesh suits in different, tones and colors. No, it's a union of fraternal peoples that come together for the principles of socialism and solidarity. And that's what international proletarian patriotism is. So I would say there is nothing new or unique of what I'm saying. I'm following in the examples of Stalin, Mao, Lenin, and Connolly. And that's good enough for me.
To be clear, though, we are Marxist-Leninists in the Stalinist sense. So we are Lysenkoists. We do reject genes and so-called bourgeois science.
I mean, the Soviet Union did have a department of eugenics prior to the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. But that's neither here nor there.
But this was rejected by Lysenko and the Stalinist faction.
Thank you for the super chat, Julie, or something. He says, as American families increasingly become racially mixed, what does organizing as primarily your Anglo-find racial category do besides create more tension among workers and family members?
Oh, well, I mean, that's easy. If people want to be part of mixed families, that's fine. It's again, identity and community comes down to self determination on an individual level and a community level. So I don't think it gets in the way that if someone identifies as part of a blended community or if they themselves are of mixed heritage and race, that's great. That's good for you. Let's work for socialism. That doesn't mean that I have to give up my identity. And I don't think it causes tension so long as we understand this concept of a union of fraternal peoples. That if we're all in this together for the sake of fighting against the capitalist class, our different identities shouldn't be a point of weakness. It should actually be a point of strength to say that we, the united working class of the world, are coming together as who we are in solidarity with one another on class lines to achieve common goals.
Okay. And from Jan, thank you for the super chat. Doesn't white socialism, wait, did I do this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I did this one. All right, so let me go to the other ones that I have. They're a little bit mixed up. But okay, so from so from Julie, I don't really know what the name says, but thank you for the super chat. He says, Levantines were considered white by SCOTUS in 1915. As Heimbach, if Levantine Americans are white or not.
Well, it comes down to, again, how they personally identify. I mean, have they been here for an extended period and they feel like they've grafted into the same shared ethnic community? Then okay. It comes down to, again, self-determination, not just existing in the idea of political decisions or things like that, but how communities, identify. And if they identify with their Levantine roots, well, that's great. If they identify as part of the white community, I'm not here as the commissar of whiteness to determine who is or isn't in my shared ethnic community. I know what I'm a part of as part of an extended family. And if they identify, well, that's great.
Also from Julie Yermo or something. Thank you for the super chat. He says, ask Heimbach to explain why a Slavic American Orthodox Christian is the same ethnicity of a Protestant Baptist who has been here since the 1600s.
Well, I specifically said, speaking of orthodoxy, the opposite of that earlier. Specifically in Orthodox communities, there's usually a tie. Usually, liturgy is done in the language of the home country. So you go to a Serb church or Bulgarian church, it's going to be in Serb or Bulgarian. You go to a Russian church, it's going to be in Old Church Slavonic, which is old school Russian in the truest sense. And in many cases, these folks have maintained their ethnic identities from their homelands. So I wouldn't want to lump them in if they still identify with being Serb or if they still identify with being Greek. Then that's a fine national identity for them to hold on to. And that doesn't get in the way of solidarity, because I don't think it should be limited based on ethnic identity who's working for socialism. But if they identify as being part of the white community and things like that, well, that's great too. It's really down to personal identification and choice, not a point of contention of you can't join my socialist party or you can't work with me. It's part of embracing the human experience of the idea of the tribe and then amplifying that through solidarity with other people.
And from History Talk, thank you for the super chat. It says, why define people from the far south of Europe, Sicilians, Maltese, etc., as white when they have light brown skin? If it's because they're Caucasian, then Pakistanis and Saudis are white too. They're also Caucasian.
Well, again, it comes down to how the individuals and the communities identify. In a lot of ways, ethnicity in the American context is kind of like how the Supreme Court talked about pornography. You can't define it specifically, but you know it when you see it. And it's part of how you identify not only as an individual and then as a family, but as a local community and then a national community. So if they choose to identify, that's great. But if you are in New Jersey and you're a Sicilian American and you still identify as Sicilian, I'm not going to impose on you what your identity should be. You can speak for yourself.
From Nathaniel, thank you for the super chat. It said, Haas, can you expound on the Lenin's thesis that fascism is capitalism in decay, and perhaps give an opinion as to whether that really is accurate?
I don't think Lenin said this. I think someone else said this. Gramsci. Lenin did not give a definitive evaluation of the phenomenon of fascism. But I've interpreted this as a break. Fascism was the breakdown, decay of classical modernity from the 19th century, specifically that form of capitalism.
From Escobar again. Thank you for the super chat. He said, "Ask Matt to explain why secular Ashkenazi Jews aren't white. He will falter and expose himself for being a fraud." He's got a lot of these these questions.
I'm glad I'm doing so much fundraising for you guys. This is great.
Yeah,
Uh,
thanks.
no, because their identity is still unique. I mean, even going back in the American South, for instance, where you have Judah P. Benjamin, who was the head of the economy essentially for the Confederate government. He was Jewish, and there were specific monuments built to the Jewish contributions and stuff like that to the Confederacy, which that's a whole another show that we could go into. But I mean, even back in the day, whether they were secular or religious, they've defined themselves as a unique ethno-religious community, and that's great. Good for them. However, we have our own shared ethnic community that we're a part of, and the problem is with the discussion on socialism. We can reduce tensions between ethnic groups by promoting solidarity. And this isn't a whites versus everyone else sort of situation. Instead, it's a great opportunity for us to come together and celebrate one another's differences in true diversity, not forced diversity or forced multiculturalism or the destruction of ethnic, religious, or cultural identities, which capitalism calls for. Instead, it's a time for us to be positive and enhance and embrace who we are.
From your average Goiper, thank you for the super chat. He said, "Opinion on distributism."
In what regard?
That
Has do you
Is
wanna-
that is that the Catholic social?
I'm not sure.
That's what that is,
Yeah.
right? Let me.
Should I read the next one and then go
Well,
back to that one?
I mean, yeah. If
Oh
you could
yeah, it's I've heard I'm not that familiar with. I don't know that. I like to look at things in their practical application, historical context, but not as abstractions. So I think that's a question of the history of that kind of thing.
From Momsilo, thank you for the super chat. Said, "Haas, you have claimed to have read Dugan. Then you should know in his book, Ethnos and Society, that American whites would constitute a narrow and not an ethnos." What?
He said a what and not an ethnos?
Constitute a narrow and not an ethnos?
A narod, yeah.
What is that? What is a narrow?
It means a people.
Oh, okay.
Dugan, a people. Well, yes, I don't agree they're an ethnos. Dugan shares this view with me.
I would politely disagree.
From Escobar, thank you again for the super chat. I used to host a podcast with Heimbach. He is lying about his convictions. Let me come on expose him. Maybe another night.
I would encourage everyone to listen to our episodes. I think it was great conversations, including I don't know, like 10 hours on the autobiography of Fidel Castro, which is a great show. So, Billy, I'm sorry we're not friends anymore, but I still respect the work that you do.
Aw. From History Talk, thank you for the super chat. Matt claims to apply socialism in the American context, but there is no identitarian socialist tradition in the US. Nazbol is a dead Russian ideology, and Matt just LARPing like in his Nazi days by pretending to be one.
Well, I mean, I would say I get all my LARPing out when I reenact. That's one of my fun hobbies. So I fill up my capacity on live action role playing. But as I said before, I think we need to develop socialism in an American context. And, I would be more of a Huey Long national Bolshevik than I would be trying to put Dugin into an American box or Lamanov or any of those guys. I can see historical inspirations and be like, oh, that's a great point. Those are some great ideas. But the revolution has to be grown organically. That's why the North Korean solution is different than the Chinese solution. It's going to be different than the Russian solution, and it's going to be different than the one that takes place here in the United States. And there's a lot we can learn from history and other movements, but we've got to develop it here for us in our current context, because I care about helping working families. I care about the future of my kids and the millions of kids that are their age that are growing up in a society that is headed towards ecological and economic destruction. And we can do better. It's not about transplanting foreign ideologies, it's about understanding a scientific analysis of economics, human civilization, and society to build a better future for all of us.
From Nathaniel, thank you for the super chat. It says, in your opinion, what is the extent of Alexander Dugin's influence on the ideology and statecraft of Vladimir Putin? Please feel free to cite any evidence, even if it's anecdotal.
I've heard rumors and nothing more. I'm sure Putin and upper echelons of the Russian military are familiar with his book, Foundations of Geopolitics. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't really know. It's hard to tell. I wouldn't overestimate it, though. I really wouldn't. I think it's very Putin. He comes. Like, it's very easy to become Dugin without even knowing who Dugin is in Russia. It's very easy to like reconcile one's own Soviet Marxist-Leninist past with a newfound discovery of Russian Orthodox civilization. So it's I wouldn't overestimate it.
I do believe, if I mean, I could be mistaken, that at least some of his materials are required reading once you reach the rank of colonel and above at some of the Russian military academies. So, I mean, I do think he has an interesting role, but it's funny you mentioned people being able to have opinions on Dugin and stuff like that without knowing him, because for a very long time, the idea of having a positive perception of the Russian Federation and its moves to block American hegemony, especially in Eastern Europe. You get called a Duganite and stuff like that. And most of these people on all sides use words, but they don't actually know what they mean. Probably never read the books. But that's the tragedy of the internet age.
From the Silent K, thank you for the super chat. If Matthew felt an authentic identity as a furry because of his lived experience, does this entail furry self-determination?
I fully encourage all furries to exercise self-determination in their own community away from us.
Okay. And then again from Escobar, thank you for the super chat. Why are Jews not allowed to personally identify as white?
Well, because they're part of their own ethno-religious community and they already have an identity. I mean, the same sort of idea as a white American, pulling a Rachel Dolezal and pretending to be black and then taking on that ethnic identity, the history, the trauma that's associated, of course, with being a black American over the past 4 centuries. It's fundamentally disingenuous. So I would say Jews have their own identity, their own religious background, and stuff like that. And for them to play a Rachel Dolezal is as wrong as they just caught a academic that was pretending to be American Indian. I mean, same the Elizabeth Warren sort of thing. It's wrong to take on identities and the experiences and histories of other peoples. That belongs to those people that have lived through it and developed their identity from that.
From Zoltan, thank you for the super chat. He said, have any of you read the North Korean publication criticizing the theory of a multiracial society as lacking character and destroying Korean bloodlines?
Well, the cleanest race, I think, is a really interesting book. I've got some critiques of it, but the discussion of Juche specifically and the conception of the nation that developed with Kim Il Sung thought is fascinating, and I think brings up a lot of very valid points. That the North Korean solution to develop socialism, to eventually develop communism, and be able to defend themselves against the American empire is fundamentally worked. They are still an independent nation, and what works for them in their context has been overwhelmingly positive, because very few nations have been able to face down the might of the United States of America and the capitalist empires and come out on top. So, what works for them, good for them.
We're almost caught up. From Voidburn, thank you for the super chat. Heimbach, you've still failed to address what makes whiteness essential or compulsory to achieving American socialism. As far as I've heard, you only repeat liberal sounding, individualistic, identitarian talking points.
Well, it's community based. It's not about the individual. It's not an identity of one. It's a shared identity within my expanded family, within my community. So, in terms of having our identity, it's part of the human experience, right? Human beings are tribal creatures. And trying to, if especially if we're scientific socialists, the idea of ignoring a huge part of the human experience on, a historical level, evolutionary level, and on an immediate level in the here and now. Human beings are tribal creatures. So trying to work against that is like trying to pretend that gravity doesn't exist or things like that. And we can either harness it so it can be used for good, or if we simply abandon identity, what that's going to do is it's going to allow the forces of reaction to appeal to this natural human characteristic to promote their own good. And you can see that with the American Empire. They were, Dr. Seuss was doing racist caricatures about the Japanese to encourage farm boys from Iowa to go kill the Japs in the Guadalcanal and stuff like that. If we ignore the human characteristics, it will end up being used against socialism. And instead, we can follow a Marxist Leninist line and have affirmative identity for a union of fraternal peoples. And that's far more positive and takes a huge weapon that the reactionary right, especially, utilizes against working class organizing.
Okay. I think we are all caught up on our super chats. Thank you guys so much. You guys have been very generous tonight. We really do appreciate it. We can go into closing statements and final thoughts if you like.
Hold, 1 second. Give me 1 second. Can you mute the stream for a sec?
Me? Mute it?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that. Like, I can mute myself.
Oh, okay. No, never mind. We can just continue.
Okay, wait, we have one more that just came in also. All right, so from Chris, thank you for the super chat. Usually, Normie Lib and Ultras try to push the fantasy that Caleb Maupin or Haas is a red fascist, which they are clearly not, and it doesn't really exist. But here we are with Matthew on.
Poor Caleb. Can I just say I've got a tremendous amount of respect for Caleb Maupin and for you guys just being willing to have this conversation. But a lot of flack has come up against Mr. Maupin recently because he said, look, he says that he supported abortion and gay marriage and is on the left on a lot of these culture issues, but he's willing to work with working class people across the board, whether it's a black church going granny in Georgia that has socially conservative views, or if that's a former Trump supporter that's seen the error of their ways and wants to build socialism, then he's willing to work with them and not divide on culture war lines. And he's being attacked, as is any socialist that's willing to promote class solidarity above culture war. And it just goes to show, I think, the synthetic nature of the very vocal voices that exist in the so-called American left that has nothing to do with class and everything about pet projects of essentially like bourgeois college students and people that literally live in Portlandia.
All right, so if you guys want to do closing statements, Matt, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I guess this is my closing statement. First, I wanted to say thank you for all you guys being willing to host me, and thank you for all the commenters being willing to be here and watching our stream. And for me, the most important thing is my kid's future. I'm a single dad. I've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I know, I've taken plenty of dings when it comes to maintaining work due to my politics, but working in factories, literally working on farms and having a multitude of experiences and being part of the working class, I see how miserable things are for working people of all ethnic backgrounds. Where you trade your body and you break it down just so someone else can be rich. As Big Bill Haywood said, if someone has a dollar that they didn't earn, they took it from someone. And that's from the working class. So we have a great opportunity here, I think, in 2021, because the establishment left has fundamentally discredited itself. The so-called dissidents like the DSA have no interest in the experiences of working families, and they support the American imperialist agenda pretty much to a T. So we're not going to have help from the false populists of Donald Trump. We're not going to be able to rely on the institutional left. It's going to be up to working people, as we have historically around the world, and as we did here in the United States, especially in the 1960s. I keep bringing up the Rainbow Coalition, but I think it's a great example, or the labor struggle and the Logan County coal wars and things like that, where we can find power together through solidarity. And that means understanding who we are as individuals, as communities, and our place in a class war. Because if you don't believe in class war, it's being waged against you every single day. And it's up for us to, up to us to be able to come together in a positive way, to understand one another, respect one another, across ethnic, cultural, and religious lines to fight for a better future for my children and for yours and for everyone around the world. So that's what I want to be able to do. And I don't think the synthetic left should be allowed to say that just because you have a white identity, you don't have a place in the socialist movement. Whether someone has an ethnic identity or not, if you are a working class person that wants a better future for working class people, you're my comrade. And it's time for us to start working together. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had to interrupt the stream for a second. I sent you a Twitter DM letting you know about it. Yeah. But anyway, regardless, yeah, I mean, after this debate, I still have no idea and do not see any value in the so-called recognizing a white identity. I don't see why anyone would want to talk about white pride or white nationalism or identify white people, as a specific ethnos or as a specific nation, other than to be anarchistic and provocative against liberals. I mean, you could maybe rally white people around the fact that there is a huge pushback against like white people that you're seeing in this country around the board with Black Lives Matter and stuff. Beyond being a form of collective grievance, I don't see any such thing as a white identity. I mean, people have pointed out, how can Sicilians, how can Italians be considered white? And you responded by saying that this is just because it's their individual preference, right? And then we don't know how to distinguish them from furries. Then someone asked, okay, so why can't Jewish people identify in the same way? And you say because it's their specific background. So it seems completely arbitrary, and there's no scientific, objective, or material criterion with which we can identify that. I don't see why someone would want to cling or be so attached to any kind of white identity. I mean, the feeling you have in your stomach that attaches you to the tradition of your father, your forefathers, and so on and so on. I couldn't see how that can be reconcilable with something called white, right? I can get it if your father was from Ireland, he's from Scotland, or if maybe you just identify him as an American, he's an American, right? These are genuine patriotic and national forms of self-understanding. But white does not really, it doesn't seem to mean anything. And although maybe you could say, oh, but you're not white yourself, which again, it's so arbitrary because there's so many people who do accuse me of being white and being a white chauvinist and whatever. So I really don't know where this stuff can even begin or end. But all I can say is it seems unnecessarily divisive and within the American context, where the point is about a new American identity, a new American civilization. So, that's really what I take away. What I take away from the debate is I don't see the need for socialists to have to care to or cater to the needs of idiosyncratic individual identities, right? If someone choose to wake up one day and say, I identify as a horse, they may gallop in their private life all they want, but why should a socialist or communist organization give any attention to this or care about this, right? This is what separates genuine communistic aesthetic from neoliberal individualist aesthetic. Now, finally, I do understand why some people might say, well, then why is it that one has a recognition of black nationalism and black separatism and so on and so on? Well, the reason is because within the American context, if at least we're talking about the American descendants of slavery, they are a specific and unique nation or people or some kind of reality. Now, maybe they will in the future decide as a matter of self-determination to join in this American civilization, American project. But they have no reason to trust it is the problem, right? So that's something I just fundamentally respect. I have to respect because they were excluded from American project, right? After slavery. So that's pretty much all I have to say on that matter.
All right, we did get one last super chat. Let me just pull it up really quick, and then we're going to close this down from History Talk. Thank you for the super chat. So, Matthew, you are suggesting that if Harrison Ford, who is Jewish, doesn't identify as non-white, i.e. person of color, he is literally a Dolezal?
Yeah, Rachel Dolezal. Well, what I would say to that is if he doesn't identify with his own heritage and history, it's tragic to see the deracination and alienation, as Marx predicted, that comes with the capitalist system. I mean, the capitalist system wants to break any sort of ties of heritage, community, family to turn us into atomized producers and consumers. So it would be tragic if he doesn't have an identity. But who we are, all I'm asking for, as I said, is I don't think there should be a specific catering to just people who identify with my ethnic identity. What I want, though, is that those of us who do be allowed to be part of the coalition building for the sake of socialism. I don't think anyone should be excluded because of what their ethnic identity is. And you can see the example in socialist movements historically, where Jewish organizations wanted to have their own specific Jewish organizations in the Soviet Union, and Marxist Leninists shut that down. You can have affirmative identities and cultural expressions as existed in the Soviet Union, but no one should be placed over another. And I don't think that this should be a conversation about every other identity versus white identity, but all of us as working class people with who we are fighting for a better future for all of us. So we shouldn't exclude anyone based on their ethnic identity. And that goes for Black folks, Latino folks, Asian folks, Indigenous folks, but also white folks.
All right. Well, thank you guys both for coming. This was, I know you wanted Matthew to have it more of as a discussion in general than like a, contentious debate. So I thought this was really good. Yeah, thank you guys.
I think we can all still be friends, right?
Yeah, let's be friends. All right. Well, yeah, so I think are back tomorrow at, I believe, 6 p.m. Eastern. We got two stuff going on tomorrow. But yeah, we'll have an immigration debate at 6 p.m. Eastern. We also have a conspiracy panel at 9 p.m. Eastern, which won't be on YouTube. It'll be on Odyssey, DLive, and Trovo on whether or not the election was stolen. Other than that, the poll is up in the community section. You guys can go vote. And yeah, we'll see you guys tomorrow night. And thank you guys for coming.